Good evening, everyone. I guess you can hear. I'm Neil Lane. I'm a longtime Rice physics faculty member. I'm now happily emeritus, but still a senior fellow for science and technology here at the Baker Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Ambassador Jurigian and all of the fellows and scholars of the Baker Institute to welcome you to Rice University and to the Institute and to our extraordinary building. This is a special event for us. It's our opportunity to collaborate with the Ken Kennedy Institute on issues having to do with information technology and data and computing and so forth. So this is our first such occasion. This is also a special year for the Baker Institute. It is our 25th anniversary. It's been 25 years of policy work here, trying to do what we can to convert ideas into action. It's been an honor for me and for us in our part of the Baker Institute to contribute in this effort. I work with the Baker's Science and Technology Policy Program. That program was founded in 2003, and it's led by Baker Institute fellow Dr. Kirsten Matthews. Our research in our program focuses on policy issues, policy challenges, including federal support for research and science advice to government, with a special focus on the White House, should anybody want any science advice. The Science and Technology Policy Program also houses the Baker Institute Civic Scientist activities, which include a lecture series, school outreach program, and we send scientists and engineers to local middle and high schools, reaching more than 3,600 students. In the last 4 years, we've been doing this. Its goal is to help bridge the divide that still exists, I'm sorry to say, between science and rational public policy making. Our most recent civic scientist lecture, some of you may have heard Dr. Vint Cerf, Vice President of Google, spoke at a high school during his visit here. One, I think, perfect example of a Rice University civic scientist who's working to improve policy is our collaborator, Dr. Moshe Vardi, who you'll hear from in just a moment. He is the director of the Ken Kennedy Institute. Moshe is launching a new initiative, which we'll hear about tonight. It's titled Technology, Culture, and Society, and it will focus on the future of work in the face of increasing automation and artificial intelligence technology, among other topics. We're honored to partner with Dr. Vardi on this endeavor, and we're going to hear more about this effort from the perspective of the university, from our president, Dr. David LeBrown.
LeBron is good because then I get confused with somebody else.
Around the campus, he's known as David. He is the 7th president of Rice University. He's a lawyer. He's a good lawyer. And quite seriously, he is one of the very best known and I think most highly respected presidents in American higher education today. David will tell us a little bit about the university's perspective of this fine initiative. Please welcome our president, David LeBrown.
Thank you, Neil. The last pronunciation was the right one. But people do get confused. I ordered once some food from Buffalo Wild Wings for my children, and so I went there to pick it up, and I gave them my name, and they said, "Oh, we thought it was a joke." And I said, "Why would you think that?" And they said, "LeBron," and so I had to wait for my order there. I think some of you are not sports fans or something. That was actually pretty funny. I do, if you read your programs, you probably already figured out that I am not Marilyn Miranda. She was called away. And, a lot of people wonder what it is that a university president actually does. And a good part of my job, I'm the backup speaker. And so when anybody truly important is called away, they call me and see if I can fill in for that, which I'm more than happy to do, both for Marilyn, for this extraordinary panel, because of the questions being addressed and because of my esteem for Professor Vardy. I actually want to begin this somewhat personally. It's actually 31 years ago since I wrote with a colleague an article entitled Privacy and Information Technology. And if I hadn't been demoted to administration, I might have been actually sitting on the panel today.
We have room for you.
You have room. I don't know if I know anything anymore. But I had been teaching a course exactly on this subject, sparked by an escalating concern back in 1987 about our privacy. And one of the cases that sparked this interest actually obliquely involved Rice University and involved a very famous child prodigy by the name of William James Sidis. And Sidis had gone off to Harvard College at the age of 11, graduated at the age of 14 or 15, entered graduate school, and was sort of bullied around and sought some escape from the Harvard environment, something that's understandable through the ages, actually. But he came to Rice, essentially as a young, in effect, very young graduate student in his teens, at the age of 16 or 17, came to Rice, apparently was a terrible teacher, and left after a year, went back to Harvard, entered Harvard Law School, actually, and almost completed it, but then left and led a life that really took him into ultimately complete obscurity. And around 1946 or so, the New Yorker magazine wrote an article. They discovered where he was living in some kind of tenement in Boston. And he had developed a passion, on which he eventually wrote a 300-page book, of collecting subway tokens. And so the New Yorker ran this article that made Sidis look fairly pathetic. Here was, by some measures, the leading child prodigy of all time, a person who at the age of 11 gave lectures on mathematics to Harvard professors. That's true, not an exaggeration. And here he was living in obscurity, barely could earn a living, and had these peculiar habits and hobbies. And he filed suit against the New Yorker magazine, claiming that they had invaded his privacy by the publication and dissemination of this article. And this case became really one of the principal foundations upon which the modern right to privacy rests. In the late 1800s, two famous legal minds, Brandeis, who became a Supreme Court justice, and a professor named Warren, had written an article about the protection of privacy, and it kind of sat there without much influence for about 50 years until this case came along. And although today's panel isn't on privacy, it is very much on the question of how technology affects our world and the risks, and I think importantly, our ability to adapt to it. And so there is a school of thought that says our society constantly adapts to changes in technology. We adapt in terms of security, we adapt in terms of economics and jobs for people. And you might ask, well, what's different? Well, if you look back at this question of privacy and think, going back to the invention of the printing press, and the next major thing in some ways that changed were things like the telegraph and the railroad that allowed greater dissemination, and then to radio and to television. And think about those time periods and ways in which we adapted. And then you think about the internet and the World Wide Web. Comes about 3 years after I wrote this article. And I think what comes out of that for me is the acceleration of technological change really raises the question of how adaptable we really are. It isn't just a question of whether we can adapt. It's a question of, can we adapt and address these issues fast enough? Or is the threat always going to be ahead of us to some extent? And that really brings us, I think, to our job as a university and why we're excited about this new initiative on technology, culture, and society, because no other institution other than a university is so equipped to think about a problem like this. It's not just a problem of engineering. It's not just a problem of technology. It's really thinking about the culture of our society and our ways of adapting, and how does the economics of all this work, and how do our political systems work. And if we can't bring all those ways of thinking together to try to address this problem, we will fail. And I think Rice, given its history, has a special responsibility here, and we have the strengths that can really address this problem. So along with all the other co-sponsors tonight also marks really the launch of this new initiative at Rice, which Professor Vardy will lead. Really not lead from his perspective as a brilliant computer scientist, which he tells me he is, but really from the perspective of somebody who, I'll just say one thing that we think we've observed about Professor Vardy: we are not yet convinced that he sleeps. Because what I'll send you in the morning is just what apparently he's read over the last few hours, and it's kind of remarkable, but we've been assured he's human. But it takes somebody like this such an omnivorous appetite, not merely for things from his own field, but things across the university, to understand what's going on in our society. And I think that, along with professors we have like Dan Log, position us to really make a difference. And so I want to thank all of you for being here, and please join me in greeting Professor Vardy.
Thank you, President Tbone. I'm sorry you have to leave. Welcome, all of you, to this panel. If I ask you, maybe even 3 years ago, what do you think about technology? What do you think about Silicon Valley? People will usually say, oh, technology is cool. Silicon Valley is a font of innovation, creation of wealth, lots of jobs. I bet the answer will be somewhat different today. And a key part of why perception has changed, and I'm collecting all kinds of quotes now from the mainstream media about a description of what is it? Peggy Noonan described Silicon Valley executive as moral Martians. And if you want to know why it happened, I think 2016 was clearly what we call an inflection point, because it was a huge political event, surprising to many, many people, including apparently the winner of the election was somewhat surprised. And we're still trying to understand exactly what happened. And there are very serious allegations that there were interference in our election system based on technology. And we're still trying to sort it out. We're still trying to decide whether it was a witch hunt, or this is really something happened, between the witch hunt and collusion and everything in between. And there we are now heading into the 2018 election. And part of the question is, okay, what have we learned from what happened in 2016? So we are now, I think, 6 weeks, precisely 6 weeks away from the election. So we decided this is appropriate as we are launching this program on technology, culture, and society. They try to assess the impact of technology and its broader impact, its societal impact, its cultural impact, to focus on the immediate thing at hand, which is the foundation of democracy, elections. And we brought a very distinguished panel. We have Dan Wallach, who is a professor of computer science here at Rice University, specializing in computer security, subspecializing in voting security. This is his specialty. He is a national expert in this area. Next to him is sitting Dr. Joseph Lorenzo Hall, who is the Chief Technologist and Director of the Internet Architecture Project at the Center of Democracy and Technology in Washington, D.C., and he brings similar expertise from the policy side. So we have technology, we have policy, and now comes the challenge. Dana, devoir. How did I do? Okay, this was a challenge. I practiced all day. And this is injection of reality. We can have the academic theories, we have the policy experts. Dana is the Travis County clerk. This is where the rubber meets the road. And so the way we're going to structure this panel is we're going to go technology, policy, reality, let's call it, and each one of them will make a statement, and then I will do some engagement with the panel with Q&A. I will engage them with some questions, and then we'll open it to you. There are mics, and we'll open it to a conversation with the audience, and it will be roughly about half an hour for their statements and about maybe 20 minutes for my Q&A with them, and then we'll open it up for you. So we should be able to finish here in about 8:15. Thank you very much, and let's start with the panel. Professor Wallach, please.
Should we all go up to the...
Come here. Better to stand.
All right, thank you very much, Moshe. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm going to try to introduce a complicated topic with a lot of challenges in 10 minutes flat. So how can we do that? And I'm not going to try to do it by talking really fast. Instead, let's start off with a personal story. Back in 2001, shortly after the hanging Chad debacles of 2000, Harris County had previously voted on punch cards, very similar to the ones that were used in Florida. And there was a recognition that that was a bad idea. And I was invited to testify at my very first Houston City Council meeting. And they had a prototype of the Hardiner Civic machine that we now all vote on. And they said, all right, here you are, what do you think? And I said, this looks like a huge security problem. And I opened the side of the machine and pulled out a memory card and said, this is a regular memory card. The same one fits into the side of my computer, and there's nothing to stop me from rewriting this during an election, and that would be bad. Therefore, we shouldn't buy these machines. And of course, we bought them. And this is the story of my life. That we, in 2003, we had a chance to analyze the source code of Diebold's voting machine because they accidentally left it on the internet. And we found a huge number of security holes. Those machines are still in use today in many parts of the country, including Georgia, where there's a nice lawsuit going on right now. In the summer of 2007, the state of California commissioned a study of all of their voting machines. It was called the California Top to Bottom Review. I was part of the team that examined the very machines that we vote on here in Houston. And what we found were significant vulnerabilities, really astonishingly poor design techniques. Without getting lost in the details, let's just say that every machine has a network port on the back, and if you plug into that port, you can send the machine's instructions that let you read, write, or overwrite any part of the machine's memory, including where the votes are stored. So that's bad, but it's worse, because it turns out that when the machines all come back to the home base, there's a computer that does inventory management and copies out their memory. And that has what turns out to have what is called a buffer overflow vulnerability. And what that means is one bad voting machine can attack one server, which can then attack all the other voting machines. So by the next election, they're all running evil software. But hey, it's a theoretical vulnerability. Come on, that's not real, right? Well, the state of California heavily restricted them, and through attrition and through expense, we've now find that only 13 states still allow the use of these paperless electronic voting machines, Texas included, Lone Star State. So where does that leave us today? Well, up until 2016, if you'd said, Dan, what's the problem? I would have said, the problem is we need better voting machines. We need voting machines that are more robust, and here's how. In fact, Dana brought in me and a whole bunch of other really great tech people to help her design a new voting machine from scratch. And that was an amazing exercise. Lock like 10 smart tech people with a bunch of election officials in a room with wall-to-wall whiteboards for a long weekend. And through the power of dried apricots and wasabi peas, we came up with an amazing design. So, okay, problem solved, right? Then 2016 happened, and we learned obliquely from the FBI and DHS that there were attacks on state election officials of various kinds, but we weren't really told the details. What exactly is going on here? Something about voter registration databases, but no details. Maybe it was 11 states, no, maybe it's 20 states, no, maybe it's 33 states. We were given inadequate detail. Then I was invited to testify in front of Congress. Well, you know, my advice was, yeah, we should be worried about that stuff, and we should have mitigation plans, right? Even it's way too late, this was September 2016, to stop what we're doing and do something else. One of the most important lessons I ever learned from Dana is that you don't simply throw out a voting system and put in a new one 2 months before an election. That would be guaranteed chaos and mayhem. That's what local elections are for. You want to practice your new technology on a lower stake election. That's like that bond referendum we just had in Houston, the one that like sailed through. That's the perfect time to try something new. And you know, having as a technologist, being exposed to the real world is incredibly valuable. So where are we today? Well, probably the single best thing that happened, and it was controversial in 2016, was that the Department of Homeland Security declared voting technology to be, quote, critical infrastructure. This was seen by some as an imposition of the federal government on states' rights, but what it did in practice was it provided resources. DHS people have been going state to state, giving training, helping election officials statewide and local implement better cyber practices, better defenses, better what we sometimes call cyber hygiene. You know, like that old unpatched computer running Windows 7, yeah, upgrade it or toss it. And just upping our game is a huge value in and of itself. What I hope will happen moving forward is that we will have a graceful plan for retiring our paperless electronic voting machines. This is not a rush panic job. This is, let's think about doing this right. Let's come up with the right standards, both for the voting machines and the voter registration databases. Let's make sure we have plans for what happens if our online database goes offline at the worst possible moment. And let's do all these tabletop exercises, then let's make standards, then let's buy new equipment. To me, the single most important lesson of the Help America Vote Act in 2002, wherein the federal government gave several $1 billion to states to replace old voting machines and old technologies, and then tried to regulate them after they were sold, they got the order wrong. We need to know what we're doing and what we want to do, then do it. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. My father actually spent a year at Rice in the 60s before going to UNM and getting a medical degree. And so I just sent him a panoramic picture of the entire audience, said, I'm on stage at Rice. And he's like, oh man, I didn't even complete a degree program there. So Moshe asked, by the way, the panel you have before you knows a ton about this stuff, and so the 10-minute slice you get is a pretty narrow part of our expertise. So feel free to think of really wild questions, because we'll be happy to answer them. Moshe asked me to talk a little bit about the Great Paper Trail debate. So 2000, I was going to make some jokes. I thought there was going to be more students in the room. I was going to make some jokes that most of you may not have been born or remember, the year 2000, but that's probably not the case in this room. Most of us probably remember that very well. In 2000, one of the problems, a significant problem, was in Florida, right, that we had this problem with hanging chads. There was a very cheap, very popular type of voting machine, and we call this a machine, that is essentially a big piece of plastic that a card goes into, and you press little chads through these punch cards, and they fall into this reservoir. And if that reservoir gets too full, they don't get punched all the way. And by the way, the user interface, so the thing you look at to know where to vote for on these machines, was just really wacky. It's not the kind of thing that you could look at and say, oh gosh, I guess I should vote there for this person. And it was clear that people voted for the wrong person in Florida because of some of the designs. That whole sort of crisis where we had it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had to make a decision, right? That's not the kind of thing you want to see your electoral system having to do. You don't want the Supreme Court to have to do that regularly. That resulted in what Dan talked about, the Help America Vote Act of 2002. The Help America Vote Act did a lot of things. One of the things it did, as Dan mentioned, is it put a whole bunch of money into the market. The voting systems market in the U.S. in a sleepy year is about $150, $200 million, so not a whole lot of money. But this was $4 billion injected into the market all at once. Many election officials went out and bought whatever was on offer, whatever looked the coolest, whatever seemed to be, in a nice package that older poll workers could pick up and move and stuff like that. And inevitably, these did not have a paper trail. These did not have any form of paper. And paper, in some sense, is a real logistical nightmare for election officials. There's warehouses full of it. You got to keep track of it. It's kind of a pain in the butt. The trick is that if you don't use paper, you have very significant consequences. And in 2004, we all learned the hard way when in Carteret County, North Carolina, a very strange little voting machine that not a lot of people know about, something called the Unilect Patriot, which sounds great, right? It's a great marketing term for a voting machine. There was a congressional race that at some point during vote casting on election day, it was actually a longer period of voting, early voting, but the machine filled up with votes. And you couldn't tell. Basically, it would say error 456 or something like that. And what it was trying to tell you was, hey, my memory's full and I can't store any more electronic ballots. Please don't try and stuff any more in me. 4,400 and something people cast ballots that basically disappeared into thin air, right? There was a congressional race that had a margin way below 4,400 voters, and a judge ordered a redo of that election. Can you imagine a redo of our presidential election or a statewide election? Oh, that's crazy to think about. In fact, in the presidential election, there's no constitutional way that we know of to do that, whereas some states actually have provisions after like Hurricane Sandy and a bunch of things to do that stuff. Anyway, so that folded a lot of our brains that were already working on this and knew this was a problem. And we knew that you could disappear votes. We also knew that if you did a recount on one of these machines, it was essentially like hitting the enter button over and over again, right? Hopefully you get the same result over and over again. Sometimes you would get a different result and you don't know what's going on, right? So a famous cryptographer that some of you may know, Ron Rivest and John Wack, a guy at NIST, created this concept called software independence. All it means is that no error in the software can affect the outcome of a race, of an election contest. And the way you have to do that is make sure that you're recording stuff in a permanent, indelible, voter verifiable paper trail. So a thing that is kept separately once the ballot is cast, independently of all the software. So if something happens to the software in the middle of the day, say Dan walks in there and turns evil with horns and sticks in that memory card that he wrote over, your paper vote would still be there, and we could still go and do a recount over all those votes, and we can come to some conclusion that the paper either agrees or doesn't agree, and then you have to figure out, well, if they don't agree, what do you do, right? And that's a different question. So we all realize that we need paper. The whole rest of the last decade, from about 2002 to about 2009, was what we call the Great Paper Trail debate, where a lot of us, legal academics, economists, technologists, were arguing about, is paper a necessary element of the voting system process? And it turns out it's not necessarily paper. You can use etched aluminum, but, I mean, it'll last forever, and it's indelible, but like, who makes printers that do etched aluminum, right? I don't know anyone that does it, right? It would be hard. Anyway, so paper turns out to be the thing that people understand, the thing people can look at, and the thing that that you can recount and all this kind of stuff. It has some very unfortunate properties for people with disabilities. Like if you're a voter with sight impairment, it becomes very hard to reread that paper trail without using the same system that you cast the ballot with, and you can see there's sort of a conflict there. You want to use a different thing to read the dang paper. Anyway, around somewhere between 2007 and 2009, it stopped being a debate, and some of us didn't notice it. In fact, a proponent of internet voting, which doesn't use paper, obviously it uses the internet, not a good idea. Feel free to ask us why. Came up to us in around 2009 and said, "Oh, you know what? You guys were right the whole time. We've done recounts, and you just can't do them with these systems. We need some independent record that's kept of these things." So what's going on now? About 70% of voters will vote on systems that either are voter marked ballots, so you fill in an oval like on a standardized test or the census or whatever, or something where the machine marks a piece of paper and keeps it later for recountability, or auditing, which feel free to ask about that. 13 states still use some form of paperless system. 33 states have all systems that use paper. So you can see even though for all practical purposes the argument was settled by the end of the last decade, this is what happens, is it takes so long to change practice out in the field that it still hasn't happened completely. And there are going to be some places like Texas that are probably going to have a lot of paperless voting usage for a very long time, just because of election officials just loving their systems as they are and things like that. And it may take certain kinds of events or errors to actually fold their brains and get them to change those things. 5 states use completely paperless systems. So it's Georgia, New Jersey, North Carolina, Delaware, and nope. Oh, whatever, it doesn't matter. I'll think of it later. I always miss one of them, I don't know why. Louisiana. Yeah, it's Louisiana. Anyway, whatever. I don't know why I'm trying to do a trivia here. But all those states have made statements, or for example, Georgia, which has a really amazing lawsuit happening right now. All those states have made some sort of commitment to move to paper. So even Pennsylvania, which isn't fully paperless, but big chunks of where the people are has said all purchases in the future must be systems that have paper. Georgia, which uses the system that Dan hacked in 2003, yikes, statewide has put out a procurement tender, a request for bids that says, here are the systems we want you to come to us with. None of these are paperless systems. Anyway, so we're moving in a good direction. One of the things that I'll end with is once you have the paper, what do you do with it? Well, you know what to do if there's a recount. Those become very huge, horrendous, tons of high-paid lawyer kinds of events, which are just not the funnest thing in the world. But you need to do something regularly with the paper to understand if your elections are being run correctly and accurately. And that's just like auditing. We do financial auditing, right? And you don't say, oh, great, XYZ Corp, you've given us your audit. We don't ever need to see one ever again, right? You need to regularly audit things because something may change. Past performance is no guarantee of future results, and it's the same way in elections. So in my postdoc at NYU and a couple other places, we developed something called risk-limiting audits. This was a brainchild of a statistician at Berkeley named Philip Stark, wonderful guy. He'll run to Santa Cruz barefoot and then hitchhike back, just a really strange dude. But when he's running these 50-mile runs, he thinks of really cool mathematic things, and one of the things he created was this way of doing what I call a statistical recount, and he hates it when I say that because it's not technically correct. But we have methods, and if you're inclined, I can send you papers that show how to randomly sample ballots in order to basically do what you do in a recount without having to count all the ballots. And that's the future, and that's going to be, for the next 100 years, what the secret ballot was for the last 100 years. The secret ballot was one of the most important aspects of the Australian secret ballot of democracy that ever happened, and it spread like wildfire throughout the world, and I have a feeling that paper and audits will too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vardy and Professor Wallach, for the opportunity to be here tonight. I am tickled pink to be with y'all. I drove in today from Travis County, dealt with Houston traffic, and I have to say, Austin traffic really is, it pales in comparison with what y'all have to do. Yeah, you have it beat here. It is pretty amazing. All right, what I'd like to share with you today is sort of the schizophrenia of what happens when voters want both paper and electronic, and they don't understand why. All right, so let's talk a little bit about a bit of a review of history here. We've mentioned the 2000 election, and then it happened to us again in 2004. Well, what we have seen, I want to start with the fact that what happened in 2016 changed our world. None of us will ever be the same again since we have all realized what the Russians have done. And I do want to conclude in the end with a better description of what they have done to us than hack our voting machines. But before we get to that part, let's talk about what's happened since from 2000 to 2016. It was a slow change for especially elections administrators to get to the point where they were comfortable with paper, because here's what happened. So Congress came through with the Help America Vote Act and did dump a bunch of money into an industry, a vendor community that was not really prepared to come out with new voting systems that quickly for everybody. But they did it, and voters were busy in the background saying, we want help with our, Uncle Ted and Aunt Sally, who we have to take to the polls, and they don't have enough support for voting. They don't get a private ballot, so they wanted ADA support. They wanted a way to mark their ballots where they didn't make a mistake. They wanted a way so that they could have lots and lots of early voting locations. And most of all, voters wanted fast election results. That's what they cared about. So they were confused by the discussions in our universities about computer security. They just knew they wanted fast results on election night. Well, what happened was that we bought the new voting systems, and everybody was very pleased with the voter services that we could bring into the marketplace because of electronic voting. But some doubt began to creep in, thanks to the discussions on the internet and other people pointing out that, you can't really double check an electronic voting system, and you don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. So some of the vendors at that point in time quickly rushed to the marketplace with what they called at the time VVPAT, Voter Verified Paper Audit Trail. They were just awful. These slap on the side, paper add-ons to voting systems were just the worst. You couldn't really use them. So most of them were an under glass, rolled into a cash register kind of a thing. And if you ever tried to really go back and recount it, you were dealing with these little curly cues, and you had to put weights on top of them to get them to, pull out, and they were a mess. They were so bad that elections administrators were completely turned off, and that was their experience with paper, and they wanted to never see or hear or talk about paper ever again. It was the worst experience of our lives. So suddenly there was this entire population of voters who didn't like the under glass experience, and elections administrators who found this paper trail pretty much worthless and not useful in trying to provide any backup for electronic voting, that the whole idea of a paper trail just died on the vine. There was no support. So that as a result of that, the vendors couldn't find anybody to sell a paper trail to. And there was no way to figure out how to make use of this poorly designed product. Well, so what happened is some elections administrators started using other kinds of tests to back up their electronic voting systems so that voters would have some security, some reassurance that their systems were in fact protected. Like, for example, you can use hash code testing, you can use even parallel monitoring, you can use other kinds of tests, but those tests weren't spread out among the elections administrators either. They were tricky, they were expensive, they did not gain favor either. So what ended up happening for a very long time in the election community was elections administrators had neither. They had neither electronic auditing procedures that would help protect voting systems, and we did not have paper trail either. So what are we going to do? So two of the vendors most recently have tried to go back and recreate or establish the credibility of voter-verified paper audit trails. Well, what we've had to do here is we've had to rethink the whole thing. And we've had to rethink it from the perspective of the marketplace, which, frustrating though it is for Professor Wallach and all of the folks who've thought so long and hard about computer security, is it has to be carried through from the voter's perspective. What does it gain the voter? So what I've tried to understand and articulate over these last several years is what voters want is something that helps them prevent themselves from making a mistake. What they want is something that makes them feel assured. I try to stay away from the word feel comfortable because I do not want to undermine the reality of what a paper trail gives to electronic voting. What voters want is something that actually gives them the assurity that they can have an actual artifact. If there are any auditors in the room, you know what I'm talking about, an actual artifact that you can go back and bump up next to the electronic record and have something that proves up the veracity of each and every ballot that was cast in the election. Well, that began a discussion of, all right, then we need to start thinking about whatever voting systems we design for the future as best of both worlds. Electronic voting is not bad. So all of that world that we were in for so long, where all electronic voting was always all wrong, is not helpful for voters, and it's not helpful for the marketplace. The idea that any piece of paper that's attached to a voting system is going to be a good thing is also not accurate for our marketplace. It doesn't help our voters. So what we have to do is we have to figure out reality. What really helps the voter? Well, what really helps the voter is electronic voting that allows voters to have vote centers and early voting. If you're in a jurisdiction of any size at all, take Harris County, you can't operate in a paper-alone environment. It's paper solo can't get you there because you would have stacks upon stacks upon stacks, somehow either printed on the site or pre-printed, that would be available to any voter who would show up. And if your model is that you've got a vote center that could attract or is prepared to accept any voter from any area of Harris County to come in, then you're going to have to pre-print yourself into a huge sum of money to try to be prepared for any voter who might show up. The permutations and combinations of the ballot styles you're going to have ready at each and every one of those vote centers becomes unwieldy and overwhelming and completely expensive. And oh, by the way, there's nothing magic about paper. You have to guard it and provide security for paper just like you do electronic voting. Each and every single page of a ballot has to have its serial number accounted for. It's just like dollar bills at a bank. All right, so how do we get to a situation where we can have voters who get protections and assistance from electronic voting, as well as the assurance of a backup of a paper ballot that they can actually hold in their hand, read themselves and see that it's correct, and then put that paper element, that paper audit trail piece, into a ballot box so that it is held by the jurisdiction and is available for risk-limiting audits, or if needed, an actual recount. Those were all the things that we were trying to put together in these later years before the Russians hit. All right. In the course of all of that, marketplace schizophrenia of, the electronic versus the paper versus we really need to find the best of both worlds, it was a slow, long process. And the vendors of election voting systems had been burned once with paper trails, and so they did not come back to that marketplace easily. For many years, there was no paper trail that you could purchase legally, either under federal certification or under state certification for your jurisdiction that allowed you a paper trail. And that is what, when Professor Wallach mentioned about our attempt to put together our own voting system that offered this best of both worlds, it was out of utter frustration that we could not find a system that gave us both of these elements in ways that helped the voter, our real market, that we ended up trying to design StarVote and have a way to have forward movement in this area for the vendors. Well, StarVote pushed that marketplace. It ended up influencing the marketplace. And between that push and that influence and those multiple discussions about how are voters going to be assured that the things that have helped them cast their vote can also help them make sure that their vote is counted correctly as well. How are we going to make sure that both of those end up in the same place? Well, for Texas purposes, the current voter verified paper audit trail that is available for purchase for jurisdictions only was certified in April of 2017. So we've come from 2004, where we've been talking about this issue, to today, April 2017 was the first opportunity for any jurisdiction to buy a true verified paper audit trail voting system. And you want to buy an electronic voting system with a voter verified paper trail because it gives your voters the opportunity to have vote centers, which lets them go anywhere they want to vote, and early voting, which gives them 12 days to fit it into their schedule. So these are all wonderful opportunities for outreach. We give voters the opportunity to participate in democracy, and yet we take care of our most fundamental concerns about electronic voting. All right. The additional part about voter verified paper trail that was not sufficiently considered when the first ones were implemented is that you don't just have a paper trail. You have to use it. So you have to start from the very beginning. Voters can't be allowed to walk away with their ballot. They have to be taught and trained that, just like in any ordinary, mid-19th century election or mid-20th century election when we voted only by paper, if you walked out with your paper ballot, then you didn't vote. Well, it's going to be the same way with these new dual systems. If you walk out with your paper, then there's not going to be a match between the electronic record and the paper record, and you're going to have no vote. So they're going to have to learn that they have to put it in the ballot box. They have to keep that auditability. when we give voters the chance to do that kind of thing, then we also have to teach them how to use their paper trail. This is a whole new world for them. Voters have not been asked to take responsibility for their own ballot. This will be a brand new world for them. They're going to have to read the ballot, make sure it actually represents the intent that they meant to put on the ballot, so that by the time that they put it in the ballot box, their intent will be expressed correctly. And for voters who are needing assistance, because this is electronic voting after all, they're going to need to be able to take this paper trail to an independent reader, not the one they just voted on, but an independent reader. Hopefully it's just a step away, so that we keep them right there, so that they can have ready access to the support that they need, so that they can put it through another reader and listen to it read the paper trail back to them. So there's a lot of thought that needs to go into this paper trail part. The other part about the paper trail is, how exactly do we use it? Do we begin the audit process on election night, in the fire and fury of the election night counting? Do we start doing hand tallies of those ballots on election night? Maybe that might be the way to start them. Or are we going to have to change our laws, or maybe change procedures in the way we do counting stations on election night, so that we adjourn and then continue counting the next morning, so that we have a process for actually hand tallying these paper trails? The main thing that I would say has happened in terms of, and this is what gets me back to the big shift, we were all concentrating on how to build a system that was going to help voters, something that we could sell to, that we could market through a marketplace, and that hopefully we could even cut the costs to jurisdictions, that would offer voters all of this assistance. Where 2016 spun our heads around, and it did, was it added this completely new element, because what we learned from 2016, and it seemed like a slow, torturous process, but within 6 months, we had it all figured out. You do not have to go through the extreme effort and a table full of PhDs and the expense of getting into a voting system and actually hacking a voting system to affect the outcome of an election. We know that is now no longer a model you have to do. So whether or not your particular voting system is protected or not, that might not be the first thing that a bad guy attacks. What we have learned since then is that voter registration systems, which happen to be connected to the internet, make an easier and faster and cheaper target for bad guys than our voting systems, even though we have spent so much time trying to figure out how to protect them. Now we need to shift our thinking over to, okay, well, we always knew that anything connected to the internet was going to be an easier target, that we knew that was going to be the wrong place to be, because bad guys could sure get into that. Well, okay, now we know that. Now we're going to have to start paying attention to voter registration databases, as Professor Wallach explained in his. We know that they made every attempt to get in, and they didn't quite penetrate it, but they were so close that it was deeply concerning. But here's the real lesson of what the Russian interference taught us. You don't have to have a PhD and a big bank account to hack into anything. A hack is a rose is a rose is a rose, but a hack is not a hack. All the Russians have to do nowadays is load up on social media to say they have hacked into a voter registration, or to claim that they have shifted votes in a voting machine. And that's all they need to disrupt an election. They don't even nowadays have to actually accomplish the hack itself. They just have to say they did, and we're all dealing with the fallout of the damaged election.
Then may I suggest, this is part of the thing that was going to go in the follow-up question. So
Then let me stop there, because what I really appreciate is now what we're trying to do is figure out, we have a broader territory to cover. And it's all, what I really appreciate is the emphasis is now not so much on learning about computer security, which I have greatly appreciated the patience that all these folks have shown me in teaching me and allowing me to then teach others about computer security. But now we've got a broader a territory to cover in learning about all the different ways we need to protect our election. Some of them we are not prepared for. Thank you.
Thank you. So this was, Tena, it was a perfect lead for the questions that I want to ask the panel. So one, I want to quote from a recent article in Lawfare by Alex Stamos, who is the former Facebook security chief. So as you know, Facebook has never really owned up to how Facebook was used or not used in the election. But Alex Stamos wrote in the article, he says, there was a multi-year effort by a coalition of Russian agents to harm the likely presidency of Hillary Rodham Clinton and sow deep division in America's political discourse. This is Facebook security officer. That's what he wrote. And he adds to that, as a society, we have not responded to the 2016 election in a way that would have been necessary to have a more trusty midterm. In most cases, throwing election one way or another is going to be very difficult for foreign adversary. But throwing any election into chaos is totally doable right now. And he mentioned as one primary example, attacks on voter registration site and purging, deleting voters as one example, or even just denial of service attack. Because they connect to the internet, you can just bombard these sites with internet traffic, so they become unusable. And so at least the scope of voting, the voting machine, fall clearly on election officials. So my question is, who maintains the voting registration sites? Who establishes standards for them? Is this done by a county? Is this done by a state? How do we protect the voter registration sites? Would you like to start?
I'll start. Does this automatically come on? Thanks. It's a very good question, and it's one that I found myself about a year ago doing one of those, oh no, you got to be kidding me. Now they're going to be into the voter registration system. So it's one of those quickly, let's start talking to computer folks who are used to guarding these kinds of systems. We know how to do this. It's just that we hadn't thought about it in exactly this way. So there are a lot of things that can be done. For one thing is...
Who is responsible for them, just to educate us?
Well, structure first. What's the structure? Voter registration systems are state-connected. So what happens is that you have a relationship between each county and the state so that we maintain a statewide database that is fed by the county. So there's a back-and-forth upload-download relationship between the two. And it happens for most counties routinely every day. Some counties are what you call upload counties, and they're smaller counties, and they only do it every once in a while. The idea being that you want to have lots of activity, lots of ability for people to access the voter registration database so that they can register to vote, keep everything updated, keep everything fresh and clean, and keep the local information flowing up to the state level. And how do you do that open, all that nice free-flowing data? How do you keep that all protected and shut down? Well, with 254 either elections administrators or tax assessor collectors mostly managing the database, it is typically not the county clerk. I don't manage a voter registration database. So there are several things that have been done in this year interim since we learned about the Russians that are fairly standard practices that just were never applied before to voter registration. Homeland Security has in fact declared voter registration and all kinds of elections work critical infrastructure, and that's important because it gave some assistance to the states that has been slow to arrive to do some things to protect voter registration databases. Most counties, what they have done is they have gone ahead and said, well, we know what we need to do to protect these databases, so we're going to step ahead, pony up the money now to go ahead and take advantage of the things we know to do first, like, for example, an Albert sensor. And other people can explain what an Albert sensor is, but it's basically a thing that scans the database constantly, 24/7 to say, are there any intrusions? You also want to have a VPN that's very closed down and solid, and maybe even a governmental unit for your VPN that only allows just this to come in, and it's treated as if it's once again critical infrastructure. So it's like firefighters getting special treatment over telephone lines. It's the same thing for voter registration. It's protected. You want to have whitelisting and blacklisting so that only people who have an email address and a communication address that look like they're supposed to be communicating with that particular database, especially at the local level, actually get through to communicate with it, and all others are blocked out. So if you've got somebody from Ukraine trying to file a registration with us, they're going to get blocked. They don't come in. Well, all of those are new techniques, and there are many more that the IT guys tell me that if I tell you about it, they're going to have to take me away. So, what I would make the impression I would leave you with is this is all brand new. It is completely compressed down to the local level for counties whose commissioners' courts have started providing resources for the protection of voter registration databases, which are typically protected and run at the county level, not necessarily the individual office level. And that has been a good thing because the Russians also woke up the funders for voting registration databases too. But this is all very, very local, and you're expecting very small counties to defend themselves against giant asymmetrical state attackers, and that expectation is not realistic.
So I wanted to follow up on it. On one hand, we have the GRU, this is Russian military intelligence, and on the other side, we have all these small counties, everyone with their own system. This is Goliath against the seven dwarfs.
Yes.
Yeah.
What do we need to do to change it? Do we need to have a state-level legislation, federal legislation?
Yeah.
I mean, we discovered that all this focus on the voting machine is important, but the voting registration sites are equally important, and they have no protection.
Yeah, and so I typically talk about the predicament we're in now is trying to arm janitors against Navy SEALs. So maybe not Goliath and the seven wolves or whatever that was. But, it really is trying to make sure that our janitors have really, and I hate to say that because these are glorious people that aren't janitors, and trying to give you an idea of the asymmetry that she's talking about. We're trying to file their sticks to be as pointy as possible. And I guess some of the things that we've realized is that voting as a systems problem, for those of you in the room who know what I'm talking about, is really sort of a canary in the coal mine. It's sort of a litmus test. It's something that is a really interesting, from a research perspective, way of studying issues in critical infrastructure that regular people have to deal with, right? And so there's a heavy emphasis on making things usably secure in these kinds of things. And so, for example, I come from academia. I'm in DC. You might think I'm like this weirdo, this wonk from up there. But what we've been doing at CDT and a bunch of others with our partners over the past year is teaching election officials about digital hygiene, very simple things. And so, for example, if you ever see me speak, I do this a lot. There are unfishable forms of two-factor authentication. You can't see this, but come later and look at this. This is about a $16 thing. We all have them because we're nerds. I would be really surprised if you pull one out, Dana. Do you have one?
We're working on it.
Hell yeah!
We're
Cool.
working on
Anyway.
two-factor authentication.
That's awesome. Anyway, and what I mean by this is unfishable. And so one of the things that's really hard that I would suggest people should think about is we know how to protect ourselves for the most part against things that has happened to us in the past. And so, for example, We had Russian military intelligence spearfish 122 local election officials. And what I mean, phishing is a spoofed email that means you get it and it's meant to trick you into clicking on something or installing an attachment, and probably malware. It sucks, right? It's no fun. We had the GRU pretend to be a voter registration vendor and send emails pretending to be from the voter registration vendor to 122 local election officials. From phishing statistics, we know that the number of people who clicked on that was greater than 0. It's just how it ends up. It's about 40 or 50, maybe 20 or 30 if you have good training when it gets down to it. 20 or 30% of people click on stuff. We don't know what the heck happened, but we do know that if we got this in everyone's hands, one of the things I say is if John Podesta had had one of these in 2016, the world would be very different, because he would not have been hacked in that case. Who knows what the world would look like? It's 2018, anything's game, right? But these are the kind of things we're doing, and some of the things that are in the margins that are really interesting areas for research or applied stuff, for example, I'm trying to hopefully play to some of the people in the room, there are things like ransomware. And this is malware that locks up your computer and usually displays a big skull and crossbones and demands like a certain number of Bitcoin, this weird cryptographic currency, before it will unlock your files, right? We've seen that hit entire municipal agencies, like the city of Atlanta, municipal government got hit by this and were locked up. They lost a bunch of police evidence. Horrible things happen. It's very hard to go from 0 to 60 when your whole system of record has been, locked up, and you have to sort of replicate it and start running your elections again. Mm-hmm. There are things like that we don't have very good solutions to. Whereas with voter registration databases, some of the problems we had there, and I promise I'll stop. We saw injection attacks. And so for the non-technical folks in the room, if you go to a web page and there's a form, like a voter registration form, and you enter your name and address, if you enter special characters like % signs and like emoji, weird things that aren't normal letters, the back end may interpret that, instead of thinking of it as data that it should put in the database, it may interpret it as a command and actually do something to the database. That's bad. This happened in 2016 for Illinois voter registration database, when the Russians, GRU, realized they could put crazy stuff in there and actually get voter registration records back, and they got somewhere between 90,000 and 500,000 voter registration records. That was the one actual penetration of a voting system, or of an election system, in 2016. All the rest were actually success stories, which the press is not incentivized to spin them as success stories. They spin them as a hack, right? Unfortunately. Anyway, so now I'm rambling. I'll stop.
Yeah. Let me follow up with Dan.
Can I just add one quick thing
Yes.
here, too?
Yes.
The thing that scares me the most about this is no longer the actual voting system. What scares me is this, what you talked about earlier, the distributed denial of service, the denial of service attack.
So I want Dan to talk about it, denial of service.
Dan, you want to talk about it then? Okay.
Sure.
That's the scariest thing.
Explain denial of service, and explain what is the risk that they pose to both voting system and to voter registration sites.
So you might have noticed that I had to wait to talk. That's a denial of service attack. So
you see, a good teacher.
Love you, Dad.
So we just call them DOS or attacks. DOS attacks are the easiest to conduct as an attacker, and they're the hardest to defend against. And that's where mitigation becomes really important. You have to engineer your election system around the idea that some important component of it might not be there at the time. And then what? So this is the kind of, all these little details that don't hit the press. What is your contingency plan if this piece doesn't work? What's your contingency plan what's your plan if there's no electricity? These are the kinds of things that election officials have to worry about. If that means that you have a fleet of Honda gas generators on the back of a truck that you'll roll out with big orange extension cords, then that's your plan. And you have to make sure that those have gas in them, et cetera. I don't want to get lost in the details. I want to hoist up to a little bit of a higher level and say, in regard to the asymmetry, how do you level the playing field? That applies to DOS attacks and everything else. So one of the good fallouts of election infrastructure being declared critical infrastructure is there's now something called the EISAC.
EISAC.
So, okay. acronym salad. EI, election integrity, election infrastructure, excuse me. ISAC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center. So the oldest and probably best known of these obscure entities is FS ISAC, Financial Services ISAC. So if you are JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs or Chase Bank or Wells Fargo, Lehman before they died, then they compete on the playing field of investments, but they don't compete on defending themselves against adversaries who want to destroy bank accounts, steal money, whatever. So there's an explicit carve-out in federal law from antitrust that allows them to collaborate as long as they're not doing business. So they can share threat information. They can say, hey, are you getting emails from a certain Nigerian dictator? Oh yeah, I got, and that lets them improve their game together. I understand that the oil industry, energy industry is looking at doing something like this. The electricity people have this, and now the elections people have it. And that gives an important opportunity for them to share intelligence and up their game collectively together. And the Department of Homeland Security can then disseminate information through this out to the states and counties. So each of these little bureaucratic procedural things seems like it's not a big deal, but these little steps are how we improve our game.
Can I just add one little thing? I want to add the cherry on top of this cake. Let me explain it to you. You have a voter registration system that you're using in each one of your polling places, which could be vote centers on Election Day. And its purpose is to qualify each voter that comes in. You're trying to determine not only which neighborhood they live in, but are they in fact a registered voter. Now think about it this way. It's as if your website got hit with so much traffic that it just crashed, right? So what do you do with it? Well, you turn it off and you reboot it and you bring it back up, right? And it takes a few minutes, and if that was what was happening to you on Election Day, and your site was hit with some sort of a denial of service, then that would be your response, right? You would just take it down, reboot it, bring it back up, next voter comes through. What if they hit you every 5 minutes with a bot that completely swamps your ability to provide that voter registration information database at each one of your locations? Now, here's the thing. So what you would plan for that is, all right, everybody has a little CD and a CD reader at every location, and you've got the entire database right there. So you can still vote voters. But whoever is qualified to vote still gets to vote. So you've got the operation of the franchise of democracy. But the operation of one person, one vote becomes compromised because you cannot go back in and in real time tell the voter registration database, check this person off your list as having voted, because you're not connected to it. So you can never protect against double voting.
So for final question, something amazing happened, which is that we scheduled this event about 2 months ago, and yesterday a book was published. The book is called Cyber War: How Russian Hackers and Trolls Help Elect a President, What We Don't, Can, and Do Know, by Kathleen Holt Jamieson. She's a professor at UPenn. She's quite credible. She's the founder of factcheck.org. So she's respected as a rather bipartisan. And she said, would Trump be president without the aid of the Russians? No, if everything else is constant. And she said her standard of evidence is not beyond the shadow of doubt, but what the standard that we hold in civil litigation, what she called preponderance of evidence. And the book really lay out the data. But it was not by attacking the voting machine. It was not by attacking the voter registration website. Okay. It was one by social media, but the other one is by attacking email of key people and then leaking that email in a very strategic way. So now that means that it's not just that we have to protect the voting machines and the voter registration site. But really, we have to look at a whole list of people whose email we want to protect, because the email of the DNC can be used to manipulate. So suddenly, it's a much bigger scope of what we need to protect. And who is there to do this level of protection?
The platforms, the email providers themselves. A lot of, like for example, Google with Gmail. A lot of these platforms at least allow you to protect yourself using pretty sophisticated techniques like these things.
You should have brought a box and sell them at the end here.
In fact, this is probably the kind of crowd where I could give you them away for free and you would probably use them. I can't give them to election officials because they cost about $20, and that's just where you're not allowed to give government employees anything more than that, right? There's ethics violations. But that's part of the thing here is that, as I was saying earlier, when the crap hits the fan on election day, election officials, when their system falls apart, they necessarily go back to their personal accounts. They're sending, Google Docs or spreadsheets or emails versus their personal accounts. And so in some sense, and all of you should think about this, if you at all are important, which means, you have assets more than like 5 figures or whatever, you should turn on two-factor and avail yourselves of some of these techniques. And I'm Joe at cdt.org. If you ever have questions, just please feel free to send me email. I'll get to you eventually. But these are the kinds of things. We need more usable forms of protection. And the last thing I'll say is, George Orwell, a while back, wrote this wonderful essay about good writing. I don't know why am I talking about good writing. He posits that good writing is like a window pane through which you see a scene. And the scene is what the person's writing about, and you don't see the window pane if it's good writing. Bad writing, it's like seeing through a dirty window pane, right? Right now what we have when it comes to platform security in terms of usability and how easy it is, these things you have to know about them, you have to use them, you have to know how to use them, you have to know what to do if you lose this thing, right? And that's...
How many people here use such things like that?
Factor authentication.
Two-factor authentication, this is a YubiKey is another way of saying it.
Maybe...
And you may use a 6-digit code. Like you're probably more familiar with this when you try and log into your bank and your bank doesn't recognize you and it texts you a 6-digit code. That's the same kind of thing. This just does it in a more secure way.
Upfront.
Anyway, but the problem is right now, the point I was trying to make with the window pane analogy is that right now the usability of our systems are such that the security stuff is stuff that it's a real pain in the butt, and it doesn't make you want to use the system. You don't want to check your email if you got to do a bunch of stuff. And so that's one of the things that I think is an important aspect of this. The platforms and the folks that deliver these services are trying their best to do this. It's just we need a lot of work to make it such that you don't notice that you're doing something that's more secure than the other option.
So I guess I'll
like to add some thoughts on that?
So I'll add a little bit more to this. So Google rolled these two-factor authentication keys out to their employees. Every Google employee is required to have one, and they claim that they've had 0 phishing attacks since doing this. And needless to say, Google is a very tasty target.
A lot of employees, too.
I would just like our Defense Department to do that for all of their contractors, but that's a topic for another day. So part of it, we can raise the game. Like if you use a Gmail account, you've got some astonishingly bright people defending you. And if you use your Gmail account in the service of communicating with human rights lawyers in countries where they operate in sketchy circumstances, you might occasionally get a little pop-up notification from Gmail that says, by the way, somebody's trying to hack you and they're pretty nasty. So Google pays attention to this stuff and will generate very sophisticated warnings. So things are, when you've got somebody like, it's not just Google, Microsoft also has people this good. Yahoo, not so much. When you've got, now you've got somebody who's every bit as good as the GRU behind you, and that makes a big difference.
Yeah.
So,
Do
election officials feel that part of their job is also to look at not just to protect their own infrastructure, but to educate the people who are involved in those election affairs about security?
Yes. And how do you go about doing that? Certainly, every county can go about educating its voters about how to use their voting system. They can educate them about their voter registration and how to keep it updated. Those are pretty finite, discrete applications. Where I think we've got a real challenge, and I don't think we have an answer, I don't think we know what to do about this, is we've been hit in a place where we are extremely vulnerable. The Russians hit us with what you would call a psyops, a psychological operation, or a social engineering. As Americans, our culture is not prepared for this. Our culture's based on honesty. We take each other at face value. If you tell me something, I believe you. It's sort of like, I cannot tell a lie. Yes, I chopped down the cherry tree. Those are our fundamental, ways of dealing with each other. And so somebody that comes in and breaks those rules and tries to trick us into thinking in something else, or manipulates one piece of information for one particular group of people, that's against what we assume on a daily basis, or assume when we speak to each other one-on-one. How we're going to get past that trickery, I don't have an answer for, and I think there are a whole lot of really smart people who are trying to figure that out right now.
Let's thank the panel. We'll now open it to questions from the audience. There are 2 mics. If you'd like to ask a question, please stand behind the mic. You may direct your question to a specific panelist, or you can ask the panel at large, and I'll help choose one of them. We'll start here, ma'am.
Yes, I'd like to know what you think of blockchain technology as a possible way of securing our votes.
You may have seen all of our heads drop. This is a very common question. I'm going to start real quick. It is the last thing anyone involved with elections should be thinking about. Blockchain voting typically involves an internet voting transaction. Internet, you can ask another question. That's a bad idea. So you're bringing in the internet into this thing, and we already have problems with that in the voter registration space. Blockchain also typically involves encrypting ballots and storing them on a blockchain, a hash chain of some sort. All that crypto is going to be broken in 10 or 20 years. We need longer-term security for voted ballot contents than that provides, especially if people are thinking of committing encrypted ballots to the Bitcoin blockchain, which is a public blockchain, 170 gigabytes, it's very, very large, 1.7 gigabytes, whatever. This is just, it makes no sense whatsoever. There are some forms of private blockchain technologies that could be useful there, but right now it's sort of caught up in the fervor around blockchain in general, and it really is just not appropriate for government elections. Just as the internet is something that you'll hear us say is just not appropriate for casting ballots in government elections, it's similar to blockchain. Hopefully I didn't burst a bubble, but I'm happy. There's a lot of writing on this. Happy to share some of that if you come grab us afterwards.
Let's move on so we get more people to get to ask questions, sir.
Yes, I'm Doug White. I'm an election judge for Harris County, and I've been administering elections
Give him a hand.
Please, people,
for the past 10 years. And frankly, I am less concerned about the security of the Harris County election system than I am about the sort of things that we're talking about here. The denial of the social media conquests, and also other issues around election IDs requirements and those sort of things. We have triple redundancy in the Harris County system. We do have paper records by precinct, not by individual voters, but the 800 precincts in Harris County all have there are 2 machines at least per precinct, each have paper copies of the vote by individual candidate for each election, and I get a copy of those, and there are 2 other copies. So I feel reasonably secure, and I'm a computer person in my paid life. So I don't think that that's really a big issue. I think our issues are much more around usability, having election systems that people will want to use. We have to be very careful about security and making it so difficult to use that the very poor turnout that we have for elections already in Texas is diminished further.
Can you put a question mark in there somewhere?
Okay, sure. And so the question I have is really it's just an endorsement of what Dana's saying, is the usability versus security has to be a trade-off.
Yes.
And we have to be recognized of the fact that there are 2 million voters in Harris counties who have to be able to use the systems under a variety of systems.
Usability and security are not a trade-off. It may seem like that. There are things that you use every day that provide you security, like door locks, right? We've designed systems, for example, in Los Angeles County that are highly usable and super secure at the same time. So please come talk to me later and I can show you that stuff. But I totally agree that it's not the sole problem, but it's table stakes for what we're doing now. You have to have these things.
Dana, would you like to make a further comment on this?
Well, I just really appreciate the approach that the whole purpose of all of this is to take care of voters.
Quick question. I used to work as an election worker from 2000 to 2007. And when the county that I worked in, we only had paper ballots. I heard some of the criticism and the concerns regarding paper ballots. My question is, with all the vulnerabilities, and I know with Windows and with any OS of anything, if you don't update it, you have problems. You're going to have security problems. So with all the vulnerabilities regarding electronic voting, why don't we just go back to paper? Back to Scantron ballots. I know I heard those concerns, but if we're talking about the integrity of our election, no paper ballot can be hacked, if you will, to use that language.
Yes.
Well, yes, it can, especially with the readers, right? But as long as those are not on the internet, where's the hacking from Russia, or where's the hacking from a foreign nation?
So let me speak to this, because I like paper. There's a great joke that if we didn't have paper in our lives and then somebody invented paper, it would be a huge success. It's lightweight, low power, fault tolerant. Paper is great stuff. High resolution, great in low light. Yeah, it doesn't lose its memory. You can't be hacked. No, the paper also, by the way, is relatively affordable. And if you don't have the constraint of needing to have vote centers like we do for early voting, where you can preprint them per precinct, then the costs can be very reasonable. And there's a hybrid technology called a precinct-based optical scan, where there's basically a glorified fax machine bolted to the top of the ballot box. So it scans the paper on the way in, and then you can get rapid tallies. The problem with paper became widely publicized in 2006 in Minnesota. Was it 2006? Yep. In Franken versus Coleman for Senate. So that's Al Franken, the former comedian and now former senator. It was a very, very tight race. And Minnesota has the same standard as Texas, which is called, quote, the intent of the voter, which means that when you have a very, very, very tight race, you end up with weird ballots being adjudicated in front of a court. And every single weird ballot, different people will intuit the intent of the voter differently. And that ambiguity is a nightmare if you're trying to run an election. So this is why we like the idea of having a computerized device in the front to interact with the voter, large fonts if they have low vision, headphones if they have no vision, etc., that prints a piece of paper that the voter puts into a box. So we want the benefits of the computer on the front end and the benefits of the paper on the back end.
Yeah, and I would just add really quickly that it's about usability, scale, and a few other properties, but you can do a lot more in a computer interface than you can with paper. So if you think about Los Angeles County, 5 million voters, 12 languages, one of which has no written form. How do you design a ballot that can do that? You have to be very careful, right? They pick up ballots in helicopters, right? And so, you need to, and just in terms of efficiency, these systems can count and get you an unofficial result from millions of people very quickly. And then you could have, people don't realize this, but there's this period of time after the election, you may know this, 15 to 30 days, depending on the state, where that's when the actual sort of crossing of the T's and dotting of the I's happen. That first result that everyone's like, yeah, I'm going to concede or whatever, that's actually unofficial, right? It takes a whole process to do that stuff, and so it takes much longer to count that stuff. But I would just say that it's trying to use the computerized technologies for what they do well, but not sort of ceding all of our agency to those things.
Over there.
Excellent. Thank you for the talk so far. It's been great. My focus is on America. We're the arguably most powerful country in the world, the wealthiest government in the world. Our government wields trillions of dollars a year. Their legitimacy is granted through the democratic process. The democratic process must have integrity. Election integrity is key, right? So my question is for each of you, we've heard so far today the dangers and the pitfalls of our current democratic process. Do you believe in the integrity of our election system? And if you do, how would you massage the voters' opinions or ideas?
I absolutely believe in the integrity of our democratic process, but here's the thing. We are being threatened, and we can't go into denial about that. We're going to have to smarten up, and we're going to have to pay closer attention to it. 2016 meant brand new world for us, and that means new procedures, new ways of waking up. In much the same way we saw our airports change after 9/11, we're going to see voting change after 2016.
So you see the loss of freedoms with the ways that our airports have changed?
I hope not. I hope not. I hope not. But the ways that we try to protect the voter registration roll, how do we keep that thing up and running and maintain that connectivity? Because if we don't maintain the connectivity, then we run the risk of double voting. The risk of not keeping that connection to that internet connection up and running is that you can't protect one person, one vote. If that's our goal, is to protect one person, one vote, then we have to maintain the connectivity. So it depends on what your goal is. I don't think the goal is to restrict anybody's access. The goal is to keep everything running.
Yeah, and I would just add, we talk about this a lot, and I'm sorry I didn't say this earlier, but the number one threat to our elections is people not voting.
Yeah, that's...
Well, 50%.
And we are here as doom and gloom because we know so much about it, but we're so focused on fixing things that we have to emphasize that the number one thing you could do to make this a less democratic society is not vote and not have your private preference registered about the political choices.
Very good point.
That you were able to vote on, right? And we should have started with that. Yeah. Please go vote. Please volunteer to be a poll worker if you have 16 hours on a day.
I am.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on. Ma'am?
Hi, I'd like to direct my question to Dr. Wallach. How do we protect ourselves from threats within our own establishment? For example, nearly 200,000 voters were purged from the rolls in New York, and it was concluded in court that that was internal. Also, as you mentioned, the path of least resistance to hacking our voting machines involves physically being there, like through the memory card. And it seems like our focus is on external influence, but how do we ensure the security of our voting infrastructure from the inside?
Okay, so that's first. Let's talk. Yeah, I like good meaty questions. Let's start with the voter registration databases. One of the nice parts is that we don't have the secrecy requirement. When you cast a ballot, who you vote for, it must be private, and that privacy ripples through everything about how you run an election. But the fact that you live at XYZ Street in apartment number 3, and you voted on this date, and you in fact voted in this primary as a D or as an R, those are public. And what that means is...
I think even which party primaries you voted for is also public.
If you vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary, that's public information. Well, and that's good, because that means that both you individually can detect, hey, where did I go? And collectively, other people can be watching out for you as well. So it's a real problem, but it doesn't have these insane privacy issues that make voting hard. So which means it's simply just a hard problem, not an insane problem. But now we're talking about protecting the machines. The second half of your question, that is an insane problem, because there's actually an engineering tension. The more I turn the knob towards protecting the privacy of your vote, at some point I'm turning the knob away from protecting the integrity of your vote. And engineering a system that protects the integrity, that your vote isn't tampered with, and the privacy, making sure that you can't be bribed or coerced to change your vote, that's hard. That's really hard. And these are some of the challenges that we work on. The current voting machines that we use today in Harris County are not acceptably well engineered against local attacks, period. And that means that we need to have a plan to sunset them, where it's time to retire them. And I would rather take the time and get something better. If it takes 2 years of planning and requirement setting and cajoling of vendors to get a better machine, then over the long term, I'll take that extra time hit versus drop everything, buy something new right now. If we take the time, we can do it right, because whatever we do, we'll have for the next decade or 2 decades after that.
Mm-hmm. So if someone did that...
sorry, ma'am, but we need to move on and get other people a chance to ask questions. Doug.
Please come up later, though.
So this is really for Dr. Hall, I guess, but I'd be curious to hear everyone's conversation on it. And again, compared to the social engineering challenges, maybe this is a detail. You mentioned auditing and sort of statistical sampling as a means of auditing. I'd be very concerned about whether you're going to get governments to ever buy into that, given that Congress, for example, there are people who just do not believe in statistics. I mean, they will not allow, by which I mean there's marked, outspoken, very, very vocal, angry resistance to the idea of statistical sampling in the census, let alone elections.
Okay.
So how do you ever convince the governments, whether it's local or state or federal, that actually statistics works?
So our Supreme Court Chief Justice used the phrase, and I quote, sociological gobbledygook. So this is a pressing challenge. From the engineering perspective, we can design really efficient sampling techniques. Nobody's gotten into the math here, but the core magic of a risk-limiting audit is that it's independent of the number of votes cast. It's only a function of the margin of victory. So I'm going to channel Philip Stark, who designed it. If you want to know whether there's too much salt in your soup, you don't eat the entire pot of soup. You stir it up really good and you take a spoonful. And that will tell you whether there's too much salt. And we can do exactly that when we're trying to confirm because the purpose of an audit is not to confirm the margin of victory. The purpose of an audit is to confirm the winner. And that simplifies the math enormously. And we're talking about sampling 30, 40 ballots out of a county of millions. So it's statistically very efficient. Some places in California and Colorado have bought in, and we hope this spreads nationwide.
So it's a really hard marketing problem. And Colorado has passed a law statewide, and they're doing this stuff. It's kind of weird doing something in your postdoc, and then like a state is doing it statewide 10 years later. Yikes, right? Virginia and New Jersey have both started using these things. There's a whole bunch of pilot projects. The trick is that if you can engineer the policy side, this is why I'm a policy guy. If you can engineer the policy side and say, hey, you can either do this cumbersome thing right here, or you can do this much more efficient thing, but you have to do it every election or whatever, right? Rather than certifying voting machines on the front end, which takes 2 years and doing all these testing, you say, hey, don't worry about testing, but you're going to have to verify every election. That kind of incentive is really attractive to certain election officials, and they might go. The other thing that might help is federal buy-in and federal funding, right? We need more state and federal funding of elections. Dana's heard me say this a number of times, but if the choice becomes between filling a pothole or buying a voting machine or fixing some part of the election system, they're going to fill that pothole because you better believe they're hearing about people with their suspension and transmissions going or whatever, right? And that's the kind of thing, and we need to pay election officials more. I mean, this should be a job people want to grow up to be and pay them very well. That may help with some of the insider attacks, but the statistical stuff, man, people who try to market statistical techniques have a real tough job, and it's been hard. It's why it's taken so long. But 2016 kind of helped a little bit. And they're like, hey, we have paper. What should we do with it? It's like, hey, well, we have these ways of doing it. Right? Anyway.
Let's move on.
Okay.
I'll come back to you. Yes, sir?
This is directed a little bit primarily at Ms. de Beauvoir, but everybody else is free to chime in if they like. If you're concerned about the integrity of voter rolls that are shared, between Travis County and being in the Capitol and everywhere else in the state or in any other state model, what's wrong with doing what the federal government does with classified networks? If you have a security clearance and you're a federal employee, your desk has two computers, one that hooks to the internet and one that cannot hook to the internet, that has no USB drives and only connects to other classified computers. That's expensive, but if you're not going to do that, then why not go back to what the other gentleman suggested, which worked for, I'm in the history department. For the first 200 years, all we did was paper, and nobody hacked it. So what's wrong with one of those?
Lena?
Okay. Voter registration systems are developing towards this approach of being closed and hardened and more government-only systems. Voter registrars only just figured out, as of 2016, that we had a problem. Everything was focused on the voting machines themselves, and nobody was thinking about voter registration, even though it was connected to the internet. So there's an entire community of vendors and voter registrars who were caught looking the other way. And I'm glad we all woke up. So this is all new, a brand new world for voter registration. The other piece of it about paper is extraordinarily limiting. So if you're a very small jurisdiction, paper's going to work just fine for you. If you're not, if you're big like Harris County or even Travis County, then you can't print fast enough to get out into the field a complete and accurate roll that you can actually use. I don't know what a printout for, what's the population of Harris County? Are y'all 2 million? Is it 4 million? 4 million. A book of 4 million, and the reality of having to look through that book and find your one voter that's trying to get qualified, and then split the book up, and then split your line into, add alphabet, segments, so that you can do. It does get to be absolutely impossible, and you'd have to have the entire 4 million if you had a vote center. And by the way, that's incredibly slow too. Paper is just very limiting, and you don't gain any accuracy or speed, with paper. So if you're small, that's terrific. If you're large, it doesn't help.
And I would say if you want to see examples of national models that use all paper, they're parliamentary systems where you're voting for one thing.
Yeah.
A member of parliament. Like in places like California, you vote on mosquito abatement district board members. I don't know why. Who gives a shit? Excuse my language. But there's all these kind of problems. And yeah, it may have worked for 200 years. This is not the United States of 200 years ago. People want answers now. They want us to support everything but deafblind. And there is a voting system that supports deafblind. It's very strange, but we need to be able to support all those folks. And we want people to be able to vote in the language they dream in, right? You don't want them to have to think about what a ballot initiative means in English when that's not what they use, right? And so there's just a bunch of compelling reasons that we don't use paper. And it's very simplistic to say paper ballots now, but the nuance underneath that is, imagine a large county trying to count millions of ballots by hand. I've done research on hand counting protocols. I can show you videos. It might be like watching paint dry, but you have to be. And in fact, we have someone who's done research on hand counting protocols, Mike Byrne, Department of Psychology here. Really awesome stuff. You have to use, humans really suck at counting. Excuse my language. But terrible. What you have to do is use these really complicated setups, and I'm sorry, I'll be really quick, where there are two people making tally marks, one person calling out the name on the ballot, and then someone else looking over the tallier's, over the caller's shoulder, and then those people at every multiple of 10 count say out loud what it is. So if they're ever off by one, they can revert and start back over, right? It's extremely complicated. That's how you count ballots by hand if you want to do it right, if you have a complicated ballot. It's just a really hard problem.
And very quickly, there's no such thing as a ballot. When you go to the polls, we all vote by our neighborhoods. And let me just give you an example. In Travis County, when we put things together on the November ballot, like it's very common to have the school district and the city and the county all together. There are 900 neighborhoods in just one election. That's very typical for Travis County. I have no idea how many thousands you have in Harris County. So there's no such thing as just a paper ballot.
And in primaries, you can get 30,000 different permutations.
30,000 permutations.
Ma'am, can you ask the last question?
These hackers run absolutely no risk unless they're in a country that has an extradition treaty.
Yeah.
Is there any way you can make your defenses more active so that they run some risk when they ping your computer, like a bank robber might get shot by a guard?
Oh, man.
This is a really fun question, and I'm glad we get to end with this. So imagine the hypothetical that some kid sitting in his basement in Moldova launches a cyber attack on Travis County, and then a predator drone drops a missile and blows up his house. Even if this were somehow technically feasible, military people have a concept called proportionate response. So we have to be careful what we ask for. And on top of that, the cyber world gives us incredible ability to do misdirection. You have a deal with AT&T or Comcast or some other ISP in your house, and you have a computer sitting in your house. You probably use it every day. How do you know that there isn't some Russian hacker who broke into your computer? And then from your computer in Harris County, they're going to attack Dana Debovar's operation. And then the predator drone is circling your house, right? So it turns out that
SWAT team, you know.
I like predator drones.
Okay.
I mean, either that or we could talk about cruise missiles. But the core thought here is that retribution requires attribution. And attribution in the cyber world is a nightmarishly difficult problem.
So I was thinking more of disabling the computer,
Yeah.
not the bomb.
Oh, but even hacking back, which is very much a hot topic in the computer security community right now. The computer that attacked you often is not the computer where your attacker sits.
And they may have incentives to launch them from other pieces of critical infrastructure that are not very well protected. There's a set of really good papers, if you want to dig in on this, that talk through some of this stuff, including one where we wrote a minority report saying, you guys are crazy, you're going to turn the internet into a Wild West. And let me know if you want to see that stuff, because there's a really fascinating ongoing conversation where we basically have decided what this may end up doing because you're not going to just have it authorized for elections, it's going to be authorized for many other things. You're going to have people faking attacks on their competitors to say, hey, or faking attacks from their competitors so they can say they can attack their competitors. There's no real, it's not the same as deputizing people in the Wild West, and there's or letters of marque that pirates used to use and stuff like that. It's a little bit different, and there's a bunch of really good short papers that talk about where you could go with this. So things that are called active defense, like tar pits and stuff, that if they get into your stuff, at least they have a hard time doing much, and you tie them up for a long time to do the attribution, but you're not actually destroying stuff when you don't know if that's the real attacker or somebody else.
We go to the fun stuff. This is a good note to end on. Let's thank this wonderful, insightful panel.